We're going to give it a minute here. Just so I'm going to be doing some live benchmarks for about an hour, maybe an hour and a half, shutting off at 3 p.m. my time. A few things. So this is the Asus ROG Astral OC RTX 5090 card. It's massive. It's a quad slot card. And of course it uses a lot of power. This is a PCAT showing actual power use right now. PCAT stands for Power Capture and Analysis Tool. It's made by Nvidia, so we are well over 600 watts. And I'm testing Minecraft, which, here's the funny thing. Minecraft has a bug with the RTX 50 series right now. 125 FPS, pulling over 600 watts of power, but that's at medium settings. If I go in, change the video settings, this is with ray tracing. Normally I would test at 24 chunks RT render distance. Actually, that is what I test at. So watch what happens now. Frame rate drops, but look at the power. We're down to 520 watts. PCAT's actually higher than what the in-game power shows. And if you're at less than 520 watts, or if you're at less than 4K maxed out settings, it's an even bigger change. So they're aware of the bug, they just haven't fixed it yet. Just to show you my face for a second. So the plan is I'm just gonna test some games. I'm only testing at 1440p and 4K. 4K is the primary use case for a card like the Astral. I don't think 1080p is going to matter that much. And 1080p seems to have some driver bugs issues with Nvidia RTX 5090 right now, because it, I don't know if it's CPU limitations or whatever. It's actually often slower, not often, but sometimes slower than a 4090 at 1080p. And not just a little bit, like minimum FPS was at times up to 20 or 30% slower. So they've got to fix some stuff there. That's fine. Now I gotta figure out how to, pardon me, it's gonna be shaky for a bit. I'm gonna mount my camera on a tripod and we'll get back to testing live. Actually, I gotta pull up a YouTube stream over on another computer so that if you guys ask questions, I can see them. And I'll try and respond to questions as we go every few minutes after I switch games. So welcome and thanks for watching. Give us a thumbs up. Give me a thumbs up, I don't care. All right, so let's see if we can do this. Without accidentally shutting off. So, thanks Ahmed, wants me to run DeepSeek. I'm just gonna do games right now. I might test other stuff after the fact. The primary reason is I don't do a ton of extra benchmarks on the third-party cards. I save that for the primary reviews, like the Founders Edition 5090. So I had some AI testing in there. And I mean, I'm sure other people have run DeepSeek on a 5090. I'm sure it works just fine. I don't have numbers, and I wouldn't be able to tell you how it compares. So maybe some other time, if there's enough demand for it, we'll see. Okay. What else do I need to do here? Oh. And it's warm in my office for some reason. Almost like I have a 600 watt graphics card cranking out heat. Sorry. I gotta get power to my camera so that it doesn't flake out halfway through my stream. It's just my phone. It's not fancy. Let's see, what do we, oh, here we go. There's a lot of stuff to do. All right. I'm gonna open up a door. So Minecraft, not doing as well as I would like because it's got a bug with the 50 series right now. performance, if you're wondering, for Minecraft was about 76 frames per second, 77 frames per second at 1440p, and 78 frames per second at 4K. And that's maxed out ray trace settings, but basically neither of those should be that way. They should probably be here. I'll tell you what. The 4090 was also about 76 frames per second at 4K, but 156 frames per second at 1440p. So yeah, we're not getting the proper scaling from the 5090 in Minecraft, and that's fine. All right, let's kick off Steam. Steam? What would you guys want to see first? You want to see Steam, or do you want to see something else? I'll look at my comments in a second. So we're going to start with Baldur's Gate. We'll do some Black Myth Wukong. We'll just go down the list. Let's see, mute that. All right. If you are watching and you leave a comment, I can now see. Ha! You guys like seeing my face? Should I pull back, or do you want closer? I kind of feel like there's a weird angle here. You'll see the back of my head. That's not going to work. Here, let's just go up first. A closer look. All right. Ask me questions and I will respond while we're doing this. So, one of the things that a lot of people are wondering is like, what's going on with supply and demand and all that stuff? Why are the prices so high? And the answer is pretty simple. They're high because they can be high. That's the bottom line. When you've got a scarcity problem, people want your product and there's not enough of it to go around, price will go up. And Nvidia said the MSRP is $2,000, but who knows how many they actually created so far. Could be 10,000, could be more, could be less. And when you didn't have any 4090 cards available in December and January and probably even November, like the 4090 cards ran out. And the net result there is anyone who wanted a top-end card either had to pay a lot or they could say, hey, Blackwell's coming, I should wait. And so worldwide, there's probably tens of thousands of people waiting for a 5090, if not more. And Nvidia was probably never going to be able to make enough Blackwell 5090 cards for launch to satisfy that demand. And when that happens, you get a huge jump in price. And then if they had set the price any lower, the scalpers would still get in, they'd buy cards, and they would sell them for $5,000 on eBay. It's a crappy situation. There's not a whole lot we can do about it. Nvidia usually does better at planning their launches so that the prior generation sells out and is gone just around the time that the next generation replaces it. But because of the data center Blackwell delays and packaging problems, I think that pushed everything back. And so you had this launch in January of 2025 instead of maybe October of 2024. And the supply of the 40 series started disappearing in October 2024. So actually before that maybe, but by the time January rolls around, it's like people have been going, hey, what happened to 4090 cards? Why are they so expensive? Well, there weren't any new ones being made. And so you just have the existing supply. 174 frames per second in Baldur's Gate. That's fine, right? Yeah. And this is without any upscaling. I don't do upscaling for my primary tests. I don't do frame generation for my primary tests because that's basically, it's not apples to apples. Like FSR and DLSS and XESS are not all the same. So you have to, it becomes a complex comparison if you're trying to say, oh, how does an RTX 5090 with DLSS compare to AMD's cards with FSR 3 or 2 compared to Intel's cards with XESS? And you have image quality as well as performance to factor in. And so I just like to look at the baseline performance. We're doing 4K now, getting about the same performance as at 1440p. And that's pretty much expected with Baldur's Gate 3. We are hitting CPU limits with a 9800X 3D, and you're not going to get any faster than 180-ish frames per second on an Nvidia card unless you have a faster CPU. And right now I don't know that a faster CPU exists. We've got the 9800X 3D, Ryzen 7 9800X 3D is running in my system. DDR5 6000 CL30 memory from G-Skill, 1500 watt power supply from Corsair, ASRock, Tai Chi. This is actually the X670E, so it's the prior generation, sort of. I mean, it's not prior, but it's not the newest model. It's not the X870 or whatever. That does it for Baldur's Gate. Just go back to my old settings so that it's ready for the next card. Spoiler alert, RX 9070 XT, 9070, and RTX 5070 are all coming soon. March, it looks like. So I've got about, what, a week and a half, 2 weeks, something, maybe 3 weeks before those all launch. And I got a lot of testing to do. But we're going to stop and do some some live benchmarking of the Asus card. I was intending to get these third-party reviews done sooner and ran into problems. Basically, the problems with Nvidia drivers and just a new chip and all that stuff, and it created a bit of chaos. So the net result was things got delayed, and so I was trying to get all the 4090, 4080 Super, 7900 XTX tested to go with the 5090. And the same goes for the 5080 review. I added well, I guess I didn't add anything really there except the 5080. And then for the 5070 Ti review, I added the 4070 Ti and the 4070 Ti Super, and I actually just ran benchmarks of the 7900 XT, but I haven't updated the article yet, so that still needs to happen. Yeah. So that was fun, where Minecraft ran better at 4K than at 1440p. That's how you know there's a problem. Someday that will get fixed. Nvidia's known about this since early January. I told them way back in advance, and it just hasn't been fixed yet. All right, next up, Black Myth. I'm going to go read some comments, if there are any, while we do this. We'll talk. Hi. No comments, okay. Got 16 of you people watching. Oh, Black Myth, that's right. So Black Myth is fun. We'll slouch down. Black Myth Wukong is kind of funny because, sorry, I'm changing my camera a little bit here. Gosh. You can tell I'm not a live streamer normally. I don't have a sophisticated setup. This is just for fun. This is my job. I test graphics cards, and I know a lot about graphics cards, but I'm not a YouTuber primarily. So this is just, hey, I'm doing this live because why not? Black Myth Wukong, Unreal Engine 5, and it has settings options where you can go into the graphics and display and say, hey, let's change it to lower resolution, but it seems a little flaky to do it that way. So what I've been doing is I actually go into the desktop resolution and change that. Why are we not getting that? All right. I test with TSR because you have to use some form of upscaling. So you can do DLSS, TSR, FSR, and XESS. I figured TSR, even though it doesn't look the best, it's at least agnostic. Kind of. It actually looks worse than a lot of the others, but they're all running the same algorithm, and it's the Unreal Engine upscaling algorithm. Can you see that monitor? A little bit. So we're at 1440p with very high settings. You could do cinematic, but it's not really important. It's just more demanding, and even though the 5090 could handle it, there's other cards that wouldn't handle it okay. So I decided to compromise and do very high. So we're getting 93 frames per second. No questions? Let's talk about some of the other cards though. 5070 Ti, 5080, and MSRPs. Let's talk about that. Like, MSRPs only matter when there's sufficient supply. And so contractually, Nvidia sets an MSRP for their partners, so they sell things at a certain price to Asus or MSI or Colorful, Gigabyte, whoever's buying the chips for their cards, right? And EVGA didn't like the new contracts that Nvidia was doing with the 40 series, so they bailed. That's a whole different can of worms, right? But so we have these base level prices that Nvidia sets, and they say $19.99 for a 5090, or $9.99 for a 5080, or $749 for a 5070 Ti. And there's a profit margin built in there for both Nvidia and the card manufacturers and the distributors and the retailers. But I don't know exactly what that profit margin is. 10%, 15% at each level. It's probably not huge. And the way you fix that as a add-in board partner is you sell it for above MSRP. So you make an overclock card, and then you say, okay, I'm going to try charging, instead of $2,000, $2,500. If there's enough supply, maybe you only go up 10%, 15, 20% more than the baseline MSRP. That's been the past. Right now, where we don't have enough supply, where we have this pent-up demand because we had a backlog of people who wanted to upgrade at the end of 2024 who couldn't because all the cards were getting sold out, then this imbalance means that MSRP is not going to be in effect. And it won't come into effect until supply catches up to demand, which who knows how long that takes. And there's a bunch of people getting all angry about Asus trying to charge $3,100 for this, or MSI charging, maybe it's MSI that charges $3,100 for the Supreme Liquid X. I don't know. But the net result is, if you don't like the price, you just don't buy it. That's capitalism, and that's all you can do. If we wait, prices should come down. Will they hit MSRP? Probably eventually. Will they hit it in the month? Probably not. 2 months? Maybe. 3? I think by the middle of this year, by the summertime, I think we'll probably start seeing MSRP cards reasonably available. Because we don't have cryptocurrency propping up prices like we did with the 30 series. So that means we should see $750 5070 Ti cards at that point. Maybe earlier, maybe later, maybe not at all. I can't predict the future. if I could, I would be doing a lot better than I am. I would have those 1,700 Bitcoin that I sold in 2011 back. True story. Anyway. Before the 5070 Ti launch, like everyone knew it was going to sell out. The 5080 sold out, the 5090 sold out. What we don't know is how many cards were actually sold. But all of them were sold is what it amounts to. And when you sell all the cards, then of course prices are going to go up. It doesn't mean that MSRP is a lie or fake. It just means, hey, the supply's not there to reach MSRP. Until it's there, we won't see MSRP. We kind of saw that with like even the 2080 Ti back in the day. Had $1,200 for the Founders Edition and $1,000 for the baseline models, and then the partner cards could be anywhere they wanted. They could be $1,000, they could be $1,200, they could be $1,500, and we saw a few cards hit the $1,000 MSRP during its life cycle, but not many. And a lot of times, the cheapest 2080 Ti cards before cryptocurrency mining took off again, they were still selling at $1,100, $1,200, $1,300 because they were the fastest card available, and I guess there was enough demand to support that. With the 5090 being 32 gigabytes of memory, that means it's better for AI workloads if you want to run those. It's faster than the 4090, and the 4090 was selling for over $2,000 recently at the end of last year because there wasn't enough supply, there was enough demand. So the 5090 at $2,000, it's still, even though it's super expensive, people were willing to pay that, and it stays out of stock. There's always going to be a small subset of people, rich gamers, rich enthusiasts, whatever, who they don't balk at paying $2,000 or $3,000 for a high-end card. I mean, if you made $1 million a year and you wanted the fastest PC possible, why not, right? So that's kind of the situation we're in. And you can complain about it, and you can make YouTube videos ranting about it and blame Nvidia, but like there was literally nothing Nvidia or their partners could really do. If they'd set the prices lower, scalpers would have just pushed them higher. And they were going to sell out anyway. So as a retailer, if Asus gives you cards at $850 and you know you can sell them for $950, why wouldn't you? And so Asus knows they're going to do that, so Asus says, well, let's just make the cards $950 so that we get the profit. The best and the worst of capitalism. 4K, very high settings, we're cruising along, 66 frames per second. Power draw is looking at, so there's supposed to be an overlay here, but it's not showing up. It kind of does that because I've got the frame view overlay and then the RTSS overlay, and sometimes games have their own overlay, and so they fight with each other and one of them doesn't show up, which is too bad. But I'm not going to stop the benchmarks to try and fix it because that just takes time that I don't have. I have too much testing to get done. Any comments? Anyone asking things? No, they're logging off. What's the frame rate coming through at on this? Anyone know? Kind of looks like it's doing 30 frames per second. That's too bad. I was really hoping that my phone would do 60 frames per second because that's what I would like it to do. As far as benchmarks go, I should also say there's only a couple of canned benchmarks that I use. This is one of them, Black Myth Wukong, and it's 140 seconds long, roughly. most of my other tests are all manual benchmarks, and I don't know. Sound off in the comments. Do you guys want a zoomed in view? Should I move the camera and not worry about showing my face? Or do you want to see me talking to the camera? This is all very impromptu and ad hoc and not professional, I know. I'm a professional graphics card reviewer, not a professional videographer. And it's Friday. It's Friday and I have other things that I'm going to be doing for the weekend. Maybe. Black Myth Wukong is also one of the games that supports full ray tracing. I've looked at it with and without ray tracing, and it keeps on coming back to one of those things like, does it look better with full ray tracing? And invariably my answer ends up being like, maybe, marginally, but it's not so much better that I'm willing to take the performance hit. So native 4K, we're getting 60 to 70 frames per second on the 5090. We could turn down to quality mode upscaling and get into the 100 plus frames per second range. Turn on frame gen and double that, maybe with multi-frame gen. But frame gen is, it's not useless, but frame gen is not all it's cracked up to be. Like, this is the best case scenario for frame gen right here, is showing a video that you're not actually playing because you're not interacting with the mouse and keyboard. You're not feeling how fast it is, how responsive it is. And so you go, oh, bigger numbers is better. So imagine this is MFG 4X, and instead of saying 67, you're getting like 250. Wow, that's amazing, right? But your input would still be at 60 frames per second. And so it looks smoother, probably feels a little bit better, but it like, there's games like CS2, Counter-Strike 2 that run at 200, 300 FPS, and those feel way different than MFG at 250 frames per second. And anyone who's played games should know this. And so when Nvidia has their marketing saying how, oh, it's quadrupling your frame rates, and it's like, no, it's quadrupling your frames to monitor, but it's not quadrupling your input sampling, and so the net result isn't as good as Nvidia pretends it is. But it's good marketing material, right? Good or bad, I don't know. Bad in some cases, right? Black Myth Wukong, we got, so 97 frames per second at 1440p and 65 frames per second at 4K, very high settings. And the 4090, what did we get on the 4090? So the 4090 got 76 and 47. 77 and 47. So from 77 to 97 almost, that's a pretty big jump. From 47 to 65, pretty sizable jump. Next up in my list, we're just going alphabetically, unless someone wants to request something. We're going alphabetically. So we are on Control Ultimate Edition. And I think you can see you should be able to see the rendering problems with Control at 1440p, maybe. I'm gonna zoom a little closer. I figure you guys are probably better off seeing the screen than me, and I can correct that if we need to, but let's see, let's go like this. Control. There, now you can see performance. Oh, and good, this one, gosh, let me see. I'm trying to I'll fix it. Just a second. Just a second. Why am I not streaming this? Because I'm running benchmarks. No one asked that, but I'm just letting you know. I'm not streaming this from the computer because that interferes with performance. So the best I can do is show you a live stream from a different device. If you were fancy, you could potentially output it to a secondary computer. I don't want to deal with that. See that claim earlier about me not being a professional video YouTuber. So we're doing 1440p native, high settings, which is their maximum, and high ray trace settings. And I know at 1080p, you hit 240 FPS. And the game has a 240 FPS cap. Let's see, okay. And so with that 240 frames per second cap, it ends up screwing up your minimum FPS because it's trying to stay under 240. And so the 5090 at 1080p, it runs worse than the 5080 at 1080p, and those run worse than the 4090 and the 40. Oops, that wasn't supposed to happen. That makes this a junk benchmark run, but actually this is the first run, so it doesn't really matter. I tried to test each game 3 times at the first setting because the first run, oh, here, can you see that flickering? I hope so. So this is a rendering error in control, like 2019 game, one of Nvidia's actually successful pushes for ray tracing, and Blackwell comes out and it has rendering errors. I'm trying to remember if I saw these on the 4090 as well, or the 40 series. I don't think so. I think it's a bug with Blackwell. And so I've said in our reviews, I'm like, yeah, the drivers feel a little bit raw. That's one of those things where I'm like, yeah, drivers feel a little bit raw. You can see the flickering shadows here too. It's probably not coming over nearly as well on the YouTube stream. I'm looking over at the screen for a second. Well, that shot doesn't show it. Anyway. And the benchmark sequences, they're not meant to represent everything about the game because they can't. But this is actually playing the game and feeling the mouse and keyboard response and all that stuff. And so I've switched to mostly manually benchmarking these days. It would be lovely in some ways to have everything automated. I know there are sites that pretty much do that. And the problem is while that makes it a lot easier, it also means your experience is a lot different than what you'd get if you were actually playing. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, you can see those black flickers a little bit on the YouTube video. It's actually a lot more visible in person. Doesn't seem to actually impact performance, but it doesn't look good. And this has been another registered complaint with Nvidia before the 5090 reviews went live, and it's still not fixed. Which, you know, they're dealing with a lot of stuff. They've launched 3 graphics cards in 4 or 5 weeks. I don't know. 4 weeks? Sounds right. And 5070 is coming. 5070 was going to be this month. It would have been probably this coming week, and they pushed it back. Maybe partly because they wanted to try and steal AMD's thunder. Maybe they were just trying to be a little bit nicer to GPU reviewers and not totally kill us, but it's the net result's not very nice because we've got AMD and Nvidia both sending out new cards at roughly the same time, and that's going to be a nightmare getting everything tested. The joys of the job. I get to play with new hardware, but I don't have time to play. Kicking up to 4K now. And this is a shorter benchmark sequence. I started talking about that. You know, I just picked a benchmark sequence. I run through it. You could try and do a longer one. This one's only 30 seconds. Most of mine are like 40 seconds to 60 seconds, just because I feel it's a reasonable compromise. Games like Red Dead Redemption 2 has this built-in benchmark that's stupidly long. It takes like 7 minutes to run. And half of the benchmark scenes are kind of useless, and you can't just log frame times because there's these black screens in between the benchmark sequences. And so when I was testing Red Dead Redemption 2, I would actually set things up so that I only counted the frame rates from the final test sequence. And so if you accidentally missed the start of that, it took even longer to get back and run it again. Monster Hunter Wild has a standalone benchmark, and it takes like 6 or 8 minutes to run. And it's, I just sit there and go, guys, like, no one wants an 8-minute benchmark sequence. We want probably a minute or 2 minutes. I saw someone post a comment. I'll go look at it in a second. I thought I saw the word VR in there. And the reality is, no, I don't do VR, and I'm not going to try because it's a whole nother can of worms. I know people care about VR, and just because I don't, that's not why I don't do it. It's because actually testing VR is a problem. You can save, so here's the thing. If you're playing back a benchmark sequence, that's not playing the game. It's re-rendering a benchmark sequence. It's different. And I've done it in the past. I've used that in the past, and I get why you do it, because it's easier. But the reality is it changes your performance. PUBG, I used to benchmark PUBG at one point. And PUBG, you could go back and replay your last mission. And so you could go and review your last mission, or whatever you want to call it. And you could run around it, or you could set your camera. You set your camera. So you could let it walk the same thing. Well, if you measured frame rates while you were playing the game, and then you went back to that same sequence and did the same test, you got different results. And then PUBG was updating so frequently that they would break the test sequence, so you'd have to do it again. And like, there's all these difficulties with benchmarking. And the net result is I'm at the point now where I'm just like, you know what? I'd rather do manual benchmarking and know what the game feels like than to try and use something easier and not know what the game feels like. With the exception of, like, I did use Black Myth Wukong's built-in benchmark, partly because if you don't, you have to fight new creatures every time. You have to sit there and do battles, and so it becomes non-deterministic, and that's another can of worms. I want the same sequence every time. And I don't care if other people do it that way, right? I've done it different ways over the years, and the reality is when you have all built-in benchmarks, it's easier and I feel less accurate. Others can disagree with me. I've been benchmarking since 2004. And I used to read Tom's Hardware and On Tech back when I was in college. So this is Dragon Age, the Veilguard, and it's got to compile shaders. I'm gonna walk away for a minute, see what my wife wants. DCS World in VR. I'm not playing CS. We're not doing Counter-Strike. And DCS, I don't even know what DCS is. I don't have it. I've never heard of it. But there are games that are way more demanding. Control's not the most demanding game I test, obviously. Dragon Age isn't either. Cyberpunk is one of the more demanding ones. Anyway, I'll be back. What does DCS stand for? Oh, Combat Flight Sim. Oh, see, that's the other thing. I don't like flight simulators. I used Flight Simulator 2020 and 2024, but man, I don't play those. Okay, back in a few minutes. How we doing? Oh my goodness. So long to compile shaders. So long. I kind of wonder, here, should we flip it around and talk? Get the mirror effect going on. I kind of wonder about this shader compilation stuff that's become, it feels like more games are doing it now, but it's not every game, and so I don't know why some games basically launch and you're at the menu within at least 20 or 30 seconds. Then other games can take, I mean, what was I gone? 5 minutes? 3 minutes? And we're still not done. We're at 58%. I like the mirror, Hall of Mirrors effect. Stalker 2 is another game that does a really long shader compile. I don't know if Dragon Age is one of the worst in my current test suite. There's Dragon Age, there's Stalker 2, The Last of Us, Final Fantasy 16 does a shader compile. It's not as bad. Hogwarts Legacy shader compile, that's not as bad. I feel like also, and this is the funny thing, is the 9800X 3D that I'm using, the CPU, I feel like that does make the shader compilation take longer. That Intel's i9, I have a 13900K, which is I mean, the 14900K is only barely faster, like 5% at most. So it's not a huge deal. And the new Core 9 Ultra 285K, I have to say that slowly and think about it because they changed the naming dynamics. That's faster in some things, but slower in games. I don't know how it does on shader compilation though. So this is where I'm like, yeah, maybe I do need the 9950X 3D when it comes out. Probably not. Probably the second CCD and AMD's Ryzen 9000 without the X3D cache. I think that will make it so that it's generally a bit slower in games. Like it will be at best equal to the 9800X 3D and at worst a few percent slower. I mean, at worst it could be more than that, but hopefully not. FPS in the Primax Crystal with higher ultra settings. Yeah. See, that what I try and do for games is game benchmarks is I want a variety of games and I want a variety of engines and I want the games to be as relevant as possible. So games that are easy to run, like Counter-Strike 2, I don't really bother with testing because everything runs it fast enough. And it's funny because Nvidia used to have the whole frames win games thing before they came out with the 40 series and frame generation. Now it's like, frames kind of win games. No one that I know who's a really competitive gamer turns on frame generation when they're playing a competitive game. I think that says a lot. All right, we're done. Oh, we're kind of done. Because you know what? Well, let's see what it's set to. Settings, graphics, yeah. So the display is at the wrong resolution for starting, but that's not a problem. You can change that. The problem is that I need to turn the graphics to my test settings, which is ultra. I turn off ray tracing in this game because it's one of the many games where ray tracing just doesn't seem to really make it any better. It just makes it run worse. And when you change those things, it wants to restart. But now that it's run once, the shader compilation, it more or less checks the shaders rather than recompiling. So that's good. We just need to wait for the launch time now. What are we up to? 2:15. 45 minutes left. Name a game in my test suite, and if you don't know what my test suite is, look on Tom's Hardware and look at the 5080 and 5090 reviews and the 5070 Ti review. If there's a game on there that you would like me to test on this live stream, let me know. I can jump the queue and do a different test. But we're on Dragon Age the Veilguard for the time being. Man, I wish that were clearer. Oh, okay. It's just blurry because it was a black screen. All right. Got to kill all the barrels. Sorry, OCD. We won't really destroy all the barrels every time. Maybe. So we're getting 163 frames, 170 frames per second at the start. It will be lower as we're moving through the level. Yes, I do roll and destroy those boxes in the benchmark sequence. Don't ask why. I need to do something while testing. One of the interesting things to me about like Dragon Age the Veilguard, I don't know, like from what I played of the story, and I haven't played further than where I'm benchmarking, that water incidentally is one of the only places, not only, but it's one of the things that looks better with ray tracing. But again, the performance hit is so high that I'm like, no, I'll take worse looking water because so much of the game doesn't have water. Anyway, Dragon Age the Veilguard. If you look at something like, I'm trying to think of it, like Stalker 2 as an example. So Stalker 2 uses Unreal Engine 5. Dragon Age the Veilguard uses its own engine. I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head. But Unreal Engine 5 has this serious pop-in problem where the level of details... Oh, I didn't roll. It doesn't really affect the score. I checked. But you have this pop-in problem where you'll see the geometry and the meshes shift and load in. And you saw that on that tree right there, flickered in a little bit. So it happens in Dragon Age, but it's not nearly as visible and jarring a transition as what you see in Stalker 2. And I just wish they, especially when you're at maxed out settings, like you guys, not you guys, but developers, like you should make your games not have pop-in at max settings as much as possible. Like maybe it's not realistic to do that. Stalker 2 at epic settings, because it's an Unreal Engine 5 game, so they don't call it Ultra, they call it epic. But at epic settings, it's pretty CPU demanding too. And I don't know, you never know what the game engine is doing, as like you're not the developer, I'm not the developer, so I don't know all the math and computations and AI work that's running in the background, and maybe that's why it's so demanding on the CPU. But when you see the way Stalker 2 looks, it's not bad, but it's not amazing. And when you see the way it runs, and I compare that to like Dragon Age the Veilguard, and I'm like, I think Dragon Age the Veilguard, the general quality of the graphics looks better than Stalker 2 and runs a lot better. So that's kind of the wrong way to do things. Unreal Engine 5 and Unreal Engine 4 before it, man, they have a lot of issues, let's just call them. Unreal Engine feels like it makes it easier for game developers to do things, but they don't necessarily have to do them well. And the net result is you get a lot of games that just feel poorly optimized. See, 4K Ultra, still getting 126 frames per second. I think if you max out the ray tracing settings in this game, and it's not ray tracing heavy, I can show it just for kicks when we're done. It probably still gets like 90 frames per second on the 5090, is my recollection. Maybe it's not that high. Maybe it's that if you use the ultra defaults that have selective ray tracing, that doesn't hurt performance that much. It does increase the memory load, and because I want to test on as many GPUs as possible, I don't like settings that I know will push way beyond what the 8GB and 12GB cards can handle. I can also hear the little fans powering up on the ROG Astral. It's definitely working hard in this game. What's our PCAT say? So the power up here is saying 525 whatever watts, but the PCAT is usually 5 to 10% higher than that because it's like the real power draw, not the software reported power draw. It varies by card and manufacturer as well. If I remember right, AMD cards, their software reporting to RTSS is still, it's not the full GPU and memory and graphics card and VRMs. So you get like you get a better power number if you use the software than if you use a hardware PCAT type device. And I used to use our own cybernetics. It's not one that we made, but Aris, the guy who used to review power supplies for us, he has his company called Cybernetics, and they did some stuff with power and power supplies and whatever. He's a big power supply guy. Anyway, I have a system that used that, and it worked for what I used it for, but the problem was is scaling up to 600 watts was kind of problematic, difficult. And so when Nvidia came out with the PCAT and they showed it to me, I was like, yes, please send me that, because I want something that will be able to scale up to whatever your GPUs use without melting. My Pownetics thing, if you think the melting problem was limited to the 16-pin connectors, yeah, if I had 300 watts going through each of the Pownetics 8-pin connectors, it was not good. I did melt one of my cables one time. So I tried to keep it down to like one 8-pin connector, or one connection per 8-pin strand. But the problem there was the, what do you call it? The strands. Here, let's turn on ray tracing. Max ray tracing, ultra ray tracing. Oh, did you see that? Look. Ooh. See, that's the kind of stuff I'm like, okay, so we go from 112 down to 94. So this is full maxed out ray tracing now. Still getting 100 frames per second in this view. So it totally runs okay on a 5090, which you kind of expect. At least that's what I expect. And you could turn on DLSS 3. I don't know if this one has DLSS 4 support yet. I don't think it does. It might have the override option. So look at the lake here, and watch the fish jump is the real telltale. With ray tracing, the fish jumps, they reflect properly. I'm screwing up my benchmark, but I don't need this benchmark run. So see that green fish? And it kind of reflects the fish. Now, if we turn off ray tracing, now watch when the fish jump. They get this blurry, streaky approximation beneath them, which looks kind of garbage. And you see that on the docks as well. So that's without ray tracing. And I mean, what if we just say ultra ray tracing? Does that fix it? No. So I don't need ray traced ambient occlusion. How much does that matter? Yeah, 10%. Anyway, see how the docks look correct now, more or less. That's what ray tracing does. If you have a 5090, yes, you can do this. If you have something like a 4070, it would choke at 4K. All right, enough talk about Dragon Age the Veilguard. We're done with that. Yeah. Okay. Any comments, any questions, any requests of games that I normally benchmark? Because every game, you know, you have to test it on so many cards. And so you can't just like quickly, oh yeah, I'll start testing another game, because that takes a lot of effort and time. So we got 127 at 4K versus 177 at 1440p. And then with ray tracing, it was 86 at 4K. And that wasn't like the full test sequence, but close enough. I was hoping more people would want to comment. My job is boring, people. Do you see now? It's not as exciting as you thought. Crude Arcs wants to know how much system RAM should you have versus DRAM. And I think that's changed over the years. My general philosophy is that your VRAM amount should not be more than your system RAM. That just seems kind of silly to me. And that's not entirely correct. That that mentality that I have. Like, you can have less VRAM, or sorry, you can have less system RAM than VRAM, and it's not the end of the world. But I just always think, I'm like, well, why would you? So if you got a 32 gigabyte 5090 card, I'm kind of like, yeah, you should probably have at least 32 gigabytes of memory. And that's what I'm running. I've got 32 gigabytes, two 16 gig sticks. I said earlier, DDR5 6000 CL30. You get a small benefit from the expo speeds and the lower latencies. It's not huge, but if you're getting like a top-end GPU and a top-end CPU for gaming purposes, then yes, I would get the nicer memory as well. There are games that do scale beyond 32 gig. They're not super common. I'm trying to think, someone did some testing, and I think maybe Flight Simulator 2024 benefited from 64 gig. I'm just trying to remember off the top of my head, so that's probably wrong. But there are a few games that have shown benefits with more than 32 gig. But we're not at the stage yet where I feel like 64 gig is at all a requirement for gaming. Give it another few years, and I think your enthusiast systems will move to 64 gig. So this is a Plague Tale Requiem, just kind of the beginning. One of the interesting things with a Plague Tale Requiem is the mouse responsiveness is very much tied to your frame rate, and it's inversely tied, sort of. So like here, I'm getting 170-ish frames per second at 1440p Ultra, and I have to crank up the DPI setting on my mouse to maximum to make it responsive. Other games, I have to crank the mouse DPI down to minimum to keep it from being too responsive. This one, like the higher your FPS, the less responsive the mouse gets. So kind of interesting that, I don't know, that's like a programmer thing. A developer wrote some code that worked that way, and I don't know why they would stick with that. It doesn't feel right to me. Dishonored 2 had, I think they fixed it with a patch. At launch, gosh, what was it? There was something where the input responsiveness was linked to performance, and I can't remember if it was like this, where if you got running too fast that it became really sluggish, or if it was the opposite, where if you were running fast that the game became super responsive and was hard to control. But I just remember it was messed up at launch, and then they fixed it. That was back in my PC Gamer days. That's what I worked at PC Gamer for almost 5 years before coming to Tom's Hardware, and they're both owned by Future PLC. But so it's an internal company transfer. $185 with 147 on the 1% lows at 1440p, and then so this is another shorter benchmark. Like, different areas of the games will perform differently. That's kind of the well-known adage. This section early in the game seemed to be at least reasonably demanding. I don't know if it's actually the most demanding or even close to it for this game, but all of the trees and shrubbery did make it at least moderately demanding, and so the GPU does seem to be the limiting factor here as well, even at lower settings. So you even see scaling at 1080p, going from like 4090 to 5090 and such. Maybe not so much there, but power draw. So PCAT, or not PCAT, the RTSS is showing 600 watts. The PCAT is probably showing, it's showing spikes up into the 630 watt range. Let me read those off when I get out of the game. So I've got a little script that I wrote using GAWK, G-A-W-K, to extract data from the CSV files that are generated by FrameView, which is based on PresentMon and yada, yada, yada. Anyway, the point is the PCAT gives power and it updates, I think, every 0.1 seconds, whereas like RTSS, I think it only updates every second. And so the PCAT is more accurate. And so my script, I added a thing to actually tell me the maximum power draw as well as the average. Oops, that's not right. No, go back. Oh, okay. So, check this out. I don't know, you probably can't read this. So these are the results: 183, 184 on the first run, which is why I tossed that. 186 at 1440p, 115 at 4K Ultra. Then we got the 1% lows, the true minimum FPS, that's the absolute single worst frame time converted into FPS. GPU clocks are 2.85 or 2.83 down to 2.75. Then we get power, GPU power. 618, 622, 621, 637 at 4K, 639 at 4K. That's the average power during that benchmark run. Peak power, 666, 666, 673, 683 at 4K, 688 at 4K. So transient spikes of 0.1 seconds where it hit 688 watts. Now, the 16-pin adapter is only rated for 600 watts. And then the PCI Express slot is rated for 75 watts. And the reality is that it's pulling the extra power from the 16-pin, which is good. You don't want it pulling from the slot. But these 5090 cards are spiking well above 600 watts at times, especially the factory overclocked cards like the Asus ROG Astral that I'm testing. Let me look at comments again. What happens when you have less system RAM than VRAM? So in theory, all of a game's assets are loaded into system RAM, and then like the textures that are being used, actively used, also get put into VRAM. That was back in the day. Modern games, I think, are able to load textures directly into VRAM and don't have a copy in system RAM necessarily, or they can use so you can use system RAM as either an inclusive cache or an exclusive cache. And if it's exclusive, then it means like, hey, if it's in VRAM, then we don't have to store it in system RAM. But if it's not in VRAM, then we have to store it in system RAM. Or else what you would get is, oh gosh, I need this texture, so I need to load it off of your storage, which even if it's an SSD, it's going to be much, much slower than your system RAM, never mind your VRAM. So that's why in general, I've always felt like you should have at least as much system memory as you have graphics memory. But there are workloads that don't keep a copy of everything from VRAM and system RAM. I don't know if games qualify for that, but certain workloads do. Do you want to see Stalker 2? Or do you want to see Flight Simulator? Or I don't want to do F124 because it's boring. Here we'll do Horizon Forbidden West just because it's faster at loading. So anyway, yeah, like if you have a third card and you have 16 gig of system memory, like that, it'd be interesting to test. To test right now already. So I don't, but someone else could test it. Maybe when the launch cycle is past and we're on to like the summer months and the summer doldrums and no new stuff is coming out, maybe that'd be an interesting thing to test. But then the problem is I don't have 8 gig of the same speed as my DDR5 16 gig sticks. So what you'd want like DDR5 6000 CL30 at 8 gig sticks, 16 gig sticks, and 32 gig sticks, and then you could do the testing. And you would also need a game that uses more than 32 gig of, well, no, that uses more than 16 gig at least. And for 64 gig to matter, you'd want it to use more than 32 gig. And this one's a big large 89 complete. It gets to that point really fast, and then you sit and wait. It's like the old Windows 95 install. Anyone else old enough to have done Windows 95? So Windows 95, when you were installing from floppies even, I remember doing that, it had this progress bar in the middle of the display, and even after all the copying, it still took a lot of time for it to like detect your devices, whatever it was doing. Anyway, the first version of Windows 95, it would show that progress bar at like 80 to 90 to 95% complete in probably 20 to 30% of the actual time. And people got really upset about that. And so Microsoft actually fixed that with Service Pack 2. They made it so that the install time, the progress bar was more a better estimate of how much was actually left in your installation progress. It's never perfect because I think what happened was they were probably counting it by number of files that had been copied, or else it was like the number of steps they might have to do at a maximum, but a bunch of the steps got skipped, and so some of the later steps took longer. But yeah, it wasn't done with ill intent, I don't think. They just didn't try to make it fully accurate. Watch her dress on this. I don't know if you see that as much as I can live, because you're probably on a 30 FPS stream and I'm playing on a 240 hertz monitor. But when you go above about 150 frames per second in Horizon Forbidden West, it screws up. What's her name? Aloy? I can't remember her name now. It's been too long. It starts with an A, I'm pretty sure. Anyway, like the physics of her skirt and bag and stuff get all wonky. And it's probably because it was ported from like PlayStation. But at the same time, they fixed it up to about 150 frames per second, maybe 144. I don't know exactly. But at some point you pass that speed and the dress, just the skirt and everything just starts going crazy. And so at 1440p, you see that on the 5090. If you have a slower GPU, it looks just fine. And everything else seems to render properly. It's just like her skirt, which you see constantly while you're playing the game. So it's kind of, I'm surprised that that was never fixed. I wonder if it does it if you're using like frame generation to get higher speeds, because this game does support DLSS 3. All right, so that takes care of 1440p. Move on to 4K. Something else, you'll notice I'm not restarting the game in between switching settings. That's one of those things where VRAM matters. If you have sufficient VRAM and then some, you rarely see a performance drop between resolution switches. And some games you can switch settings as well, others make you restart. But if I were doing this on an 8 gig card, in order to not have a little bit of cruft left over using VRAM, I have to restart every time I switch the resolution. And if you're playing the game, a lot of times what that ends up meaning is that you'll see performance degrade over time as you play the game. So 8 gig cards are really, they're not good for ultra settings in new games these days. And I'm kind of unhappy about Nvidia's approach to VRAM with the 40 series and 50 series, I'm sure we're going to get 8 gig 5060 and 5060 Ti cards. There's rumors that we'll also get a 16 gig 5060 Ti, but that they'll use a 128-bit interface still. So they could do 12 gig if they shift to 3 gigabyte GDDR7 chips, which they are doing on the laptop 5090. So they do exist and they are being used, but they're not doing it on their desktop chips. And I've said before, maybe in my articles as well, I've said they're probably going to do the super refreshes in a year and switch those to having 50% more VRAM, which is what I would wait for if you're looking at one of the lower spec cards. I think the 5090 with 32 gigs is fine, but the 5080 with still 16 feels a little chintzy, and it would have been so much better if they had done 3 gig chips and 24 gig of RAM. And then the 5070 Ti I think is okay at 16 because it's supposed to be a less expensive card. I know it's not selling at MSRP, but assuming it gets down to MSRP, oops, clicked my button, it's a reasonable compromise. $750, 16 gig. Like, I would like more, but it's not critical, like absolutely critical, let's say. It would be nice, but it's not an absolute requirement. Once you get down to the 5070 with 12 gig, that's where I start going, oh, we're still doing 12 gig with a 5070? Because Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, if you turn on full path tracing and ultra settings, or I guess they have ultra, and then they have like very ultra, and then extreme, I think are their top settings. Something like that. Anyway, if you even do ultra with maxed out ray tracing, full path tracing in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, I believe it exceeds 12 gig of VRAM, even at 1440p. And the game is such that it just tells you straight up, like, you can't do this. It doesn't say you can't do this, it crashes, which is not a good experience. So they really needed more VRAM on the lower tier cards, and it looks, all appearances are that they won't do that, and that's really kind of irritating to me, that because we called them on it with the 4060, and it's like they're doubling down on it with the 5060, and I say that because we have the 5070 the 5070 laptop GPU has 8 gig, and that will be the same chip used in the desktop 5060 Ti. So we know it's a 128-bit interface as well, and it's like, oh, come on, Nvidia, don't do this again. And so then they do neural texture compression, and they talk about neural materials and all that stuff, and they're like, look, we can reduce the memory footprint by 1/3. And I'm like, yeah. And the developers need to recode their games to use that, and it's only supported on the 50 series. And so, like, if every game would benefit from that, it would be fine. But there's a ton of existing games that won't use it and will never use it, and so you're stuck with 8 gig in those games. Speaking of, let's run Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. So crude arcs, the thing is, like, your VRAM capacity is tied to your memory interface width. So if you have a 256-bit interface, which is what the 5080 chip has, the GB203, with a 256-bit interface, if you do 2 gigabyte memory chips, then you get 16 gig. If you do 2 gigabyte chips on both sides of the PCB, which is like clamshell memory mode, it's what professional cards do, then you could get 32 gig. And now they have 3 gigabyte chips instead of 2 gigabyte chips, so you can do 3 gigabytes and get up to 24 gig. You get 50% more memory. But there is no reasonable way that I know of to get to 20. I guess in theory they could do half of the chips as 2 gig and half of the chips as 3 gig, but I don't know if that would work, and I think there would be problems doing that. That's kind of like the GTX 970 where they had the it was a 256-bit memory interface, but it was really 224-bit plus 32-bit. And there was actually a class action suit about that because they kind of lied, and they didn't tell anyone until they were caught out. And the settlement didn't really matter. And the card performed okay for its day. Like it usually didn't matter that it really only had access to full 3.5 gig of RAM. But there were a few edge cases where it did matter. And Nvidia wasn't really forthcoming about that. And I think if they tried to do a mix and match of 2 gig and 3 gig chips on a 256-bit interface, so you'd have some channels with 3 gig and some channels with 2 gig, I think it'd just be messy and would probably hurt performance. So if they do a 5080 Ti or a 5080 Super, whatever they call it, they use the same GB203 chip, and then they use 3 gigabyte GDDR7 chips instead of 2 gigabyte, then that gets them up to 24 gig. If you wanted to do a 20 gig card, the way to get there would to be a 320-bit memory interface with 2 gigabyte chips. That's what the RX 7900 XT uses, and it's what the RTX 3080 10 gigabyte card used, except the 3080 only had 1 gigabyte chips. But so if you want 20, you need a 320-bit interface, or you could do a 160-bit interface with clamshell memory and 4 gigabytes per 32-bit channel. So you're constrained in what you can actually do in capacity. You can't just like add 4 or whatever. You actually, and this is the weird thing about the 50 series. So the GB202 chip that's used in the RTX 5090, it's a monster. It's 750 millimeters squared, and it has a 512-bit memory interface. That's my dog. And so it uses 16 channels of 16 32-bit channels of GDDR7, which is where the 32 gigabyte comes from. Now, if they do clamshell memory, they get 64 gigabytes. If they do 3 gigabyte chips, they get 48 gigabytes. If they do clamshell and 3 gigabyte chips, they can get up to 96 gigabytes. And I think that's what we will see on a future professional data center chip or card based off of the GB203. But for consumers, they're going to do 32 gig. And I don't know if they'll ever do like a 5090 Super or 5090 Ti or even a Titan Blackwell. They could. Nvidia could do that. But I don't think it will. We'll see in 2018. And part of the reason for that is those Titan cards kind of overlapped with their professional cards. And so for gamers, people were going, oh man, like that's a $2,000 card. Who would be stupid enough to buy that? Well, now we have enough people that are rich enough or stupid enough or whatever to buy them for gaming purposes. But back then, people would complain about the price, but then you'd have professional users going, oh, you know what? Instead of buying what used to be called the Quadro cards, which are now like the Nvidia RTX 6000 or A6000 or whatever model, but you would get people that would go, you know what? I don't actually need all of the professional features. I just needed the extra VRAM, and the Titan RTX had 24 gig, whereas the consumer models only had 11 gig for the RTX 2080 Ti. And so people who wanted the memory for professional workloads would buy the Titan card that cost $2,000 instead of buying a, actually, was it $2,500? Anyway, they would buy that instead of buying a $5,000 or $4,000 professional card. And so that's part of, I think, why we haven't seen another Titan card, is because Nvidia's like, no, we don't want to cannibalize our professional sales. Let's just make them buy, like, what's the current RTX? Is it 8,000 or 6,000? The professional card that uses the previous generation Ada AD102 chip. They have a 48 gigabyte card, and it costs like $9,000. And so if they had a Titan card with 48 gigabytes, that cost even $4,000. That's less than half the price of the professional card. And so they don't want to make those prosumer cards so much anymore. AMD still kind of does that because AMD, like, they don't have a big foothold in the professional market. It's not that they don't have any place in the professional market, but in the gaming market, I think Nvidia is outselling AMD about 8-1, give or take. In the professional market, I gather that it might be closer to 20-1. that the whole CUDA thing is it's such a big deal to have full CUDA support, and it works across the whole product stack from your top end professional cards down to your budget RTX cards for gamers. And AMD is trying to compete with that using ROCm, but they haven't had full product stack support, and that's been holding them back. So there's a lot of people that are like, AMD, you need to just support ROCm on everything, or you need to make ROCm support everything that you've made in the last 5 years, and stop trying to have this like halfway support of it, because you're not going to gain a foothold in the professional market when you're doing that. I don't know if that's fully accurate or not. And there are people who prefer AMD for certain professional workloads because they run Linux, and they're like, no, we prefer AMD's Linux drivers, which are not closed source. I think that's correct. Anyway, I'm probably going to wrap this up shortly here. Thanks for joining me in my boring benchmarks. Let me ramble a little bit. I know some people, like, they think us reviewers are, like, I've had a lot of mean things said about me because of the 5070 Ti review. Like, I'm this idiot that doesn't understand how pricing works and that the MSRP is fake. And I'm like, it's not fake per se. It's just, it's not happening right now. And predicting when it will actually happen is, like, even when cards weren't in massive demand, meaning like the GTX 900 series, when it launched in 2014, they sold out, and you couldn't find a GTX 970 for $330 for a couple of months. And so this is not some new phenomenon to have their high-end graphics cards sell out at launch. It's just kind of what happens with every Nvidia generation. With the 30 series, we had cryptocurrency mining that made it like 10 times worse, and so they never had inventory. It was always sold out. With the 40 series, AI kind of started getting traction, and so I think a lot of AI people bought 4090 cards. And China bought them too. However, they had to get them, right? And Nvidia didn't want to make a ton of those cards because they could make more money making Hopper data center cards, or selling the AD102 chips as a data center Nvidia, what is it, the L40, I think. So they don't want to use all of their best GPUs as a consumer part if they can avoid it. But they determined the price, and they targeted a price of, $750 for the 70 Ti. We knew it wasn't going to stay there at launch. What we don't know is, will it get there in the next couple of months? And because of the supply chain disruptions, not supply chain, but because of they ran out of Ada cards too soon, and the Blackwell cards weren't ready soon enough. Here, we'll flip away from that because flight simulators got to get ready and load. So because of that disruption and that supply and demand imbalance, it's going to take more than a month or two, I think. I hope it takes less than 6. I hope it takes less than 4, but I don't know for sure. What I do know is normally Nvidia makes the least number of their top chip, like the 5090 GB 202 chip. And then they make more of their second chip, which is the GB202 and that or 203, and that's used in both the 5080 and 5070 Ti. And those chips will also be used in professional cards. And then they make even more of the next step down, which will be the GB205 that goes in the 5070 and the laptop 5080. And I think that's right, or no, laptop 5070 Ti. And then they'll make even more of the bottom chips that are like the GB206 and GB207 is the rumors. And they might make, because also they'll, if they did say 10,000 wafers of the big one versus 10,000 wafers of the smallest chip, well, they might get 4 times as many chips per wafer out of the GB207 or 206. So there's usually a much bigger supply of their smaller chips and their less expensive chips. And that's always the case, which is why like right now you can still find a 4060 at MSRP, more or less. But the 4070 and above are all screwed up because they ran out of inventory. And so running out of inventory of your 4070, 4070 Ti, 4070 Ti Super 4080, 4080 Super 4090, anyone who wanted to buy one of those for 3 months, 2 months, really couldn't or shouldn't at least because they were too expensive for what you were getting. Like, why would you want to buy a 2-year-old 4070 today or last month when you know the 5070 is coming out soon? And so it's going to take time for that to correct. And I know this, and my review though, I don't want to base a review on like what will hopefully be relatively short-term shortages. And ultimately the score is just a score. I mean, read the benchmarks, read the data, and then look at the actual retail price, and that will tell you what the card is worth. And if it stays at $900, that's a crappy value. If tariffs drive the price up another 10% and it's like $1,000, that's a really crappy value because the 5070 Ti isn't even as fast as a 4080 Super, which was a $1,000 card last year until it sold out, until they stopped making them. So, yeah. We're on to Flight Simulator. What time is it? It's 2:59. 2:59. Oh. So maybe we'll do one last game and then call it a day. That sound good? And this is the 2020 Flight Simulator, which means it's less demanding. The 2024 one doesn't scale as well with the Ryzen X3D chips. The 2020 version really likes Ryzen X3D. It's kind of interesting how that worked out. I don't know what changes, if it's DirectX 12 that they made some changes so that it better runs on Intel chips. It's not that it runs worse on AMD, it's just, it's no longer much faster on AMD. So I use the same Isafjordur benchmark in both 2020 and 2024 versions. But so I think we're CPU limited to maybe like 120-ish frames per second. Something like that. So this is kind of a canned benchmark because I'm just flying a path. So this plane, the Cessna, I think it pulls back to the right. So I tilt it to the left and then it kind of drifts back toward the right. And I drop the speed so that we're coming in for a landing and we get closer to the water. And the closer you are to the water, the more demanding the water rendering gets, I guess. That seems to be what's going on. So as the benchmark proceeds, frame rates start dropping. Oh, sorry, I bumped my camera. But I am not a flight simulator player is the thing. And like if you were to actually tell me like, hey, you need to play flight simulator properly and either try and land the plane or do a flight or whatever, I tried when this game came out and I'm like, this game's hard and I don't like it. Oh, See, my wing tilt didn't pick up there. So I have to restart. But yeah, Flight Simulator is kind of, this is another one where I feel like this is a perfect showcase for frame generation, because it's not like a Twitch game. So if here we are running at 112 frames per second, if you turned on frame gen and got double that, well, first of all, even on a 240 hertz monitor, it's not going to look that much smoother. And it's definitely not going to look smoother on my 60 frame or 30 frames per second YouTube stream, live stream. But if you were at like 30 frames per second, that's still playable, and doubling it 60 would look better. So that's kind of the weird thing about MFG, is where they're talking about quadrupling your frame rate. But I'm like, well, you're not quadrupling your input speed, and 60 frames per second does generally feel smooth. So if you can make that look a little smoother while feeling the same, that's not a bad thing. But it's still not the same as truly quadrupling your frame rate and input sampling rate. And it's disingenuous to pretend it is, which is what kind of Nvidia has been doing. They're like, it's a frame rate multiplier. And I'm like, yeah, it's a marketing tool that's being overused. So if you have, say, 60 frames per second native, and it's sampling at 60 samples per second, that usually feels pretty decent. If you then take MFG 2X and you make that 80% faster, so now instead of at 60 frames per second, you're at like 108 frames per second, but your sampling is half that. So now you go from 60 sampling to 54. Well, that's still going to feel pretty decent. And then if you triple it, so, you know, something like 150 frames per second, but now you're sampling at 50 samples per second. Well, it's still fast enough, so it still probably feels pretty decent. And then you quadruple it, and you get up to like 210 frames per second. And you're sampling now at 50, maybe I did that wrong. Maybe quadruple it, but you get 190 frames per second. So now you're at 47.5 frames per second on sampling. And so each level, it's like it looks smoother and it feels a little bit less good. And at some point, there's a threshold where you cross it and you go, okay, this input sampling feels too sluggish. And then Nvidia was saying, well, yeah, but if you play it with a console controller, you know, those are a higher input latency device, and people, they wouldn't feel the latency as much. I'm like, well, that's true. They probably also wouldn't need 240 frames per second. So it's very heavy on the marketing. I think anything above about 120 frames per second, for most people, that's more than fast enough. In fact, going from 60 to 120 frames per second, for competitive shooters, yes, that's helpful. For typical gamers, I think it's going to be a lot less important. I kind of bumped the wrong key there, so that was an invalid run. If you heard that, I said I bumped a key on the keyboard and screwed up that run because I don't think it came as close to the water as it normally does. So it ran faster than it should at the end. Benchmarking is hard sometimes. So this this Asus card, it's and this is the thing about this ROPS count. So the 5090 is supposed to have 176 ROPS. The full GB202 chip has up to 192 ROPS. So they disable 16 on the 5090. And somehow, some of the 5090 cards that are out in retail are apparently they only have 168 ROPS. And people are like, wait, how'd that happen? Why did it happen? That's false advertising. I've heard like TPU Tech Power Up did some testing, and they say they've got one with 168 ROPS that's up to 11% slower. But I don't like. They're comparing it against the Founders Edition, and it's not a Founders Edition card. So it's like, well, even though the Founders Edition is supposed to have reference clocks, when is reference not reference? And the answer is like sometimes you have a card that's supposed to clock higher that doesn't because it's not cooled as well or because the power circuitry isn't as good. Anyway, this Asus card does indeed have 176 ROPS. So it is the full Monty. And I had an MSI RTX 5090 Supreme Liquid SoC. And I didn't check that. I didn't think to check that. The ROPS thing only came out today. But I had this MSI card, and it ran all of my benchmarks until I got to the last 4 games that I tested, which were all non-Steam and non-Epic game launchers. And so I was like, is that what's causing it? I don't know. But 3 of them were Ubisoft games. They all would crash, and they wouldn't just crash. They would black screen and fully lock the system. It would not recover. I had to hit the reset. I mean, like I waited 20 minutes one time just to make sure. No, it never recovered. And people had all these suggestions on the video I put up saying, oh, well, you need to turn off PCI Express 5.0 mode. Yes, I tried that. You need to turn off, I can't remember, somewhere like you need to turn down your refresh rate. I did various things. Somewhere like, oh, your power supply sucks and you need a better power supply. I'm like, sorry, this is a 1500 watt high quality power supply. I tried it without the PCAT. I tried it in a separate system, like different power supply, different motherboard. It was an Intel processor, all that, different monitor even, and it still crashed. And so MSI said, yeah, just send that one back. They had me ship it back, and they are going to send out a new card, I hope. They might not. They might be like, yeah, he's going to not do a super favorable review because he had a problem card. I don't know. We'll see. But so I shipped it back, and it got picked up yesterday. And then this whole ROPS thing came out, and I'm like, gosh, what if there's a bad batch of chips that might have 168 ROPS, and maybe the MSI card that I got was one of that batch? It could have happened. But now the card is gone and I have no way of testing it. So I do know that the Asus card showed as 176 ROPS. I have not checked on the Founders Edition actually. Yeah, let me do that. I've got the Founders Edition in a different graphic system. So while Flight Simulator 2024 loads, see, this is my old test bed. So this is a 13900K system, and it's a 144 hertz monitor, and it's a Be Quiet Dark Power 13, I think, or I don't know. It's a Be Quiet power supply. Actually, I think it's the Dark Power Pro 13 1600 watt power supply. So it's a 80 plus titanium power supply, and it still crashed with the MSI card. This is the 4090 Founders Edition. Oh, can't have my pin, people. Let's see, do I have drivers installed? I do, okay. So I think the system information doesn't tell you ROPS, but it does say it's in PCI Express. Oh, hey, it doesn't say what PCIe mode you're in. Interesting. But I have GPU-Z on here. This would be really funny if this is actually the wrong value. No, 176 ROPS. So this is, can I zoom in? Here, let's pull this out. So that's the Founders Edition. I already ran this on the Asus card, and they both say 176 ROPS. So I was saying, like, I wonder now if the MSI card wasn't 176, if it was 168. But I have no way of knowing. The card is gone, and I can't get it back. It's going back to Taiwan. Okay. But yeah, this launch by Nvidia has been quite problematic, right? They've had melting cables again, and I've always felt from the beginning, I'm like, the whole 16-pin connector feels a bit like hubris. They went too far. It's smaller than the 8-pin connector in area, and carries up to 4 times as much power. I'm like, that just seems like a recipe for disaster, and you know, we're getting disasters. And so then they say, oh, we fixed it. And I always felt like their fix was more of a hopefully it's fixed rather than a we absolutely can guarantee that it will never crash or melt again fix. So I also had a video where, here, I'll show this for a second. Sorry, janky video, wobbly camera. So this is a PCAT device. And I use the 8-pin, I was saying earlier, I use the 8-pin connectors up here rather than a straight 16X connection. Oh no, oh, you don't do this. This is the worst. So I've got this MSI OLED display. And every so often, I don't know how many hours, like 4 hours, 8 hours of use, something, it comes up with this, and it's like, hey, we need to do this panel protect function. And you can delay it once, but I think, I don't know. It's not letting me delay it now. So I'm gonna hit execute, and it takes 5 minutes. It just sits there, blinking with a black screen for 5 minutes. And it always seems to happen at the worst time. All right, so back to this. We'll talk about this. So if I did the straight 16-pin connector, I swap graphics cards all the time, and I would be plugging in and unplugging this 16-pin connector a lot. And it's warm, but it's not hot. These are all like barely above room temperature. So I use the 8-pin adapter because I would rather wear out these cables and this adapter because I can replace those. I can't replace the socket on the card if it gets bad. And then these go down to a reverse adapter that goes from 16-pin to 8-pin. And then this is the 16-pin connector right here that goes over to the power supply. So I've tried plugging this into the MSI card when it was having problems. But anyway, I was testing, and right now I've got 4 single 8-pin connection cables. Over on my old system, I had these black and yellow cables that each have 2 8-pin connectors at the end. So you've got like this one, and then the one that's plugged in here. And this one that's not used, and the one that's plugged in here. And the reason I switched is because I had 2 of these black and yellow cables on this system, and I used one cable and I plugged it into both connectors on a 7900 XTX about 2 weeks ago, and it melted the connector down here. So it melted in the best place possible. This is actually, this is the melted cable. So this, I don't know what that white plasticky goop was. It bubbled out, but I just finished a test and I exited the test. And as it went back to the desktop, I heard like a crackly sound to my right over by the PCAT. And I was like, what is that? And I look over and I see this smoke and I'm like, holy crap. And luckily the card powered off. The screen went black, but the card was not harmed. The PCAT was not harmed, just the cable melted. But that was not with the, like it was because I had both of these connectors plugged into 7900 XTX, and while that should only be 300 watts or less, give or take, it shouldn't be a problem, but for whatever reason, it became a problem and it died. And so I had to, that was part of my delay on getting some of these third-party card reviews done, is my PCAT was down for a few days. I'm like, I can't do testing, help. Actually, I had a spare, so I did. All right, I'm still waiting for the OLED to reset. I think I'm in frame now. That's it. I was going to do one more game, but I think I'm out of time. Any last questions? What do we got over here? Yes. See, confused council. I don't even know what that's supposed to mean, Ranja Karpatel. What in the world? I don't know if that's supposed to be a joke or insulting or spam. So that's it. I'm gonna have to continue benchmarking another time. The Asus card, as you've seen so far, is holding up nicely. It hasn't crashed, and that's always nice after the MSI card. But I haven't. Well, okay. So I tested the Asus card with the Ubisoft games that were crashing on the MSI card, and I did that a few days ago, and it worked. So presumably it's okay, and I just don't know why the MSI card had problems. But there's always a certain percentage of product that gets to market that's bad. I would think usually it's going to be less than 1%, maybe. Some products maybe it can be higher, maybe it can be 2 or 3%, but you don't want to have a whole bunch of returns that cost time and money and erodes customer impression and all that stuff. So companies try to be good about that, but the 50 series, the 5090 in particular, seems to have had more than its share of problems so far. And it's not just MSI. MSI is a big company, and so maybe they sell more than some of the other companies. But you know, MSI cards, I've seen people post about having black screen problems, like I had. I think someone posted with an Asus card. It wasn't the Astral. I think it was one of their lower tier models, but they were having black screens. I know Gigabyte people have said they had black screen problems. We've seen Gigabyte and MSI and Manly cards, people have reported getting 168 ROPS instead of the expected 176. So, yeah, I don't know. Hopefully things get worked out. Hopefully supply improves. Hopefully prices come down. I don't think the 5090 is ever going to be affordable, though, if that's what you're after. AMD is not going to compete with the 5090 or probably even the 5080. Not directly. What they'll compete on is price with the 5070 Ti. That's my assumption. That's kind of what they've already said. They're going after the mainstream market rather than the high-end market. So we'll see how the 9070 XT and 9070 do, and the 5070 come March. Thanks for watching, guys and gals, if there were any of you there. I don't know. I'm guessing with our readership, it's like 99% not female or other. Anyway, have a good one. Have a great weekend. I'm going to end this and move on with testing. See you later. Thanks for watching.